Hi, I'm Russ Breault with the Shroud Report Education Project, and welcome to the Shroud Report. Today our guest is Father Kim Dreisbach from Atlanta, Georgia. And Kim, you are the Executive Director of the Atlanta Center for the Continuing Study of the Shroud of Turin.
That's correct, Russ. Glad to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. Now, you've been studying the Shroud for 20-plus years, and now your particular area of interest has been in the area of the historical.
Well, trying to establish where the Shroud was for the first 600 years. That seems to be important, and then we can move on from there. Beyond that, we have a pretty good idea of its history.
Now, for the first 600 years, there are clues and legends and folklores and kind of references to it, and some are hidden, and you've been just studying for years on trying to find some of these perhaps more obscure historical references to the existence of this image of this shroud.
Now, for want of a better term, I've called them spy clues, and each one in and of itself may not be significant, but when you put them all together, they have a sort of synergistic effect. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
Right. Now, what is the story behind the shroud? If the shroud is the shroud of Christ, then obviously it started in Israel in the first century sometime, and why don't you kind of take us from the first century and move us forward?
Well, yes, there's been a debate of course, whether it is a forgery in Europe or it began in the Palestine. And I think in 1998 at Turin, probably the most revelatory lecture given there was by Avinoam Danin, a botanist from Jerusalem, Israel's lead botanist, and he pointed to three pollen on the shroud. One of them, Zygophyllum, exists only from the Sinai to Jericho and slightly across the river into Jordan. Then we have, beyond that, we have Pistacia, and then we have Gundelia dumosum, which is the crown of thorns. It's the most prevalent one. Danin is also able to tell that these flowers and plants were blooming in March and April, the same time as Passover or the Christian Easter. So he says, I have no idea whose image is on the shroud, and I am not competent to say. But what I can say is its origins are in the Palestine and not in Europe. Well, we go on from there. According to legend, following that Easter morning when nothing was left in the tomb where Jesus was buried, except the shroud and other linen cloths, some of the legends say that James, the brother of Jesus, or the first bishop of Jerusalem, was entrusted to give it to Thomas, who gave it to Addai, which is Syriac for St. Jude, who then took it to a town in southeastern Turkey, then known as Edessa, today known as Urfa.
How far would that be from Jerusalem?
There was debate. Originally we thought it was very early, maybe as early as 70 A.D. I think a more accurate date, Ian Wilson, the historian, has revised it and figures it may have gotten into Edessa around 112.
But in terms of mileage, it's about 100 miles, 150 miles from Jerusalem, or is it more than that?
Maybe a little more than that.
Okay, all right.
It goes up there, the king converts, he's healed of leprosy, and that's where Jude gets the term, the patron or the saint of lost or hopeless causes.
Okay. Now, who's the patron saint of the city of Edessa?
Well, Jude and Thomas, who according to legend, remember Thomas went to India, and his bones are translated back from India, and together both sets of bones are put in the cathedral Hagia Sophia, Holy Wisdom, in Edessa. And these are the patron saints of Edessa, Addai and Thomas. And in fact, there is a whole theological school of Thomas that grows up and around Edessa. So we have that.
And interesting, the relationship of doubting Thomas.
Yes.
And I'm probably getting ahead of you, but okay.
Well, that's true. And interesting in the passage about Thomas, where the only thing that story appears only in the Gospel of John, and it is he who notices the wound in the side, whereas the other Gospels besides John talk about the hands and the feet. Somebody had to notice the side wound, and that will become important later on in the shroud, 944, when it's transferred to Edessa, and the night it arrives, Gregory the Referendarius notices not only the face, but he says he notices the blood and water from the wound in the side.
And this is when it moves from Edessa to Constantinople?
From 944, but we want to go back earlier than
right.
that and try and find out what happens. The shroud is rediscovered. Well, I should maybe lead up to that. The king who was healed of leprosy, by the time he has a grandson coming along, he says, the heck with Christianity. He reverts to paganism.
Now this is
in the city of Edessa.
This is what we call the legend of King Abgar.
King Abgar is correct. And eventually the shroud is walled up in the west wall, in a niche in the west wall, where it remains until there is a flood in 525 A.D. At that time, the Emperor Justin sends down engineers to divert the river Dason. In the course of the repairs and diversion of the river, the shroud is rediscovered in a niche above that west wall and is known once again. What becomes interesting here now, in the 6th century, is that by 550, an icon is painted and given by the emperor to the monastery of St. Catherine down in the Sinai desert. It is an encaustic icon, meaning that it is painted out of hot waxes rather than paint. And now we know through work done by Dr. Alan Wanger at Duke University that there are about 250 points of congruence, similarity between this painting and the face and the shroud. As we need only 40 to 60 to get a conviction in a court of law today, it's pretty convincing that the artist who did that portrait.
So now I think we have an image of it right here.
Yes, there it is, and amazing for the fact that it was done in 550 A.D. Still with us today. It escaped the iconoclastic controversy when many relics were destroyed because it was so far away from the coast of Egypt down on that Sinai Peninsula that nobody wanted to drive a camel or a horse that many days in the hot sun. They said, let them keep them. We are not going down there to destroy them. So it's with us today. The same emperor, the western extent of the Byzantine Empire at that time, was in Ravenna on the eastern coast of Italy, south of Venice. And if we go there to San Apollinare Nuovo, a church there, in the clear story, we have two sets of mosaics, one done prior to 550.
I think we have an image of that right here.
All right. And here you go. Here is the Apollo-like, beardless Christ, the way he was most often portrayed before the shroud was rediscovered. But amazingly enough, in the same church, on the other side of the clear story, when you look up, after the shroud is discovered, we find what is the traditional shroud face today. One nostril larger than the other, the huge eyes, the little flecks of hair up on the forehead. They don't quite know what to do with the neck. And this is the classic face that has come down to us through the ages.
And so from that point on, it seems that all the images begin to change.
Yes.
Into this
stylized,
long hair, full beard,
right,
flattened nose, hollow eyes, and you know, we're going to be right back with this in just a minute. So stay tuned to more of the Shroud Report. Hi, I'm Russ Breault, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. And our guest is Father Kim Dreisbach from Atlanta, Georgia, and we've been talking about this fascinating trail that you called spy clues, and some of those clues can be found in images, but you've also specialized in finding these clues in the historical literature. Why don't you give us some of those things?
Literature and liturgy.
Liturgy, okay.
Which is the worship of the church. In 325 A.D., Pope Sylvester called a council at the Baths of Trajan in Rome. And at that council they decided that no longer could you celebrate the Mass, the Holy Communion, without having a cloth representing the shroud on the altar. Now today that would be like placing a casket of a revered person on the altar, and you wonder why you would take supposedly a symbol of death and put it there. As we look further in that same century, we come on to a fellow named Theodore of Mopsuestia. And he tells us that in the course of the liturgy, they develop a little ceremony to place that cloth on the altar. 2 deacons carry the cloth down the aisle in procession and lay it out upon the altar. But the interesting thing, even more interesting than that, is he also adds the fact that these 2 deacons represent the figure on the shroud. This is 4th century.
And that's 4th century.
4th century.
So what that says then is that as early as the 4th century, somebody knew that the shroud existed and that there was an image on it.
Yeah, well, we think earlier than that.
Okay.
And I can't imagine it's being saved out of that empty tomb unless there was something highly unusual about it, because it's covered with blood, it covered a condemned criminal, and
to the Jews it would be considered unclean.
A corpse, so it was triply unclean. There had to be something unusual for them to save it. Well, let's jump ahead. Now, we were just in the 4th century. Let's jump ahead to the 7th century in Spain to a liturgy called the Mozarabic Rite. Mozarabic just means these were Spaniards living in Spain at the time of the Muslim occupation. And there we have in this rite a bishop named Leandro, who was a young priest, had been sent to Constantinople along with Gregory from Rome, who became Pope Gregory the Great. They are ambassadors, if you would, within 50 years after the shroud's rediscovery. Leandro comes back and oversees this Mozarabic rite, which is still celebrated daily in Toledo at the cathedral there. In that Mozarabic rite, there is an allatio, which is a fancy word for a preface for Holy Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday. We've always wondered what Peter may have seen in that empty tomb. Luke tells us he went away wondering at what he had seen without specifying it. But in this Mozarabic rite, it says, Peter saw the vestigia, a Latin word that is not precise. It can mean traces, it can mean footsteps and other things, but sometimes even imprint, traces of the dead and newly resurrected man on the shroud.
Now that's from the 7th century.
7th century.
So even here, so we go 4th century, 7th century, we're talking about historical references to an image on this cloth.
Right, and one of the other things that is there's a much debated thing called the Mass of St. Gregory, named after the Pope, the same fellow that we had talked about earlier, who had been the ambassador with Bishop Leandro to Constantinople. And if you look at some of the artwork that represents this Mass, you see a little Christ with the hands crossed, just as they are on the shroud, standing on the altar in the midst of this Mass, supposedly deriving from a vision had by Gregory. So you have 2 people who were probably, no doubt, made aware of the shroud's existence and what was on it while they were in Constantinople, who returned to their own countries and, in a sense, possibly have incorporated it within the liturgies that they deal with. In the same century, suddenly...
Now, what century is this now?
We're in the 7th century.
7th century, okay.
In the same century, the first coin bearing an image of Christ's face is struck in Byzantium. The first of these coins is a tiny little one about the size of our dime, called a tremesis.
And is that what we have here?
That's what's up on the screen at the moment. It struck between 692 and 695 AD. Again, Dr. Alan Wanger has done a study with his polarizer overlay technique.
Now, okay.
And shown us that there are enough points of congruence that this is the shroud face, though it's sort of a primitive one.
I mean, when I look at that, I mean, I'm looking at an image that just seems incredibly like the shroud. I mean, well, uncannily so.
It does, and in fact, if you had the time to look at it, even those vertical lines that pass for the eyes are really vertical threads that are weave anomalies in the cloth that show up in that eye area.
I'm going to go back one slide because I think we have an image of the face there.
All right.
Just to compare.
All right. But what will grab a lot of people a great deal, it's not so well seen on this one, but underneath the Adam's apple are two lines, two parallel lines. Remember that a die maker or an icon painter or whoever was doing this was an act of religious devotion. Prayers were said before, during, and after. And the belief was the more points that corresponded to what you were copying, the greater spirituality there would be, or the holier the object would be. Those two lines under the neck on the shroud go back to the premises. And if you look there, again, down the neck, they don't quite know how to end it, or those two parallel lines, they'll show up again. We'll see it on the next coin, too, struck in the same year.
Now, this is the next coin, okay.
All right. This is a solidus. It is a larger coin, and in this...
Now this looks very much like the shroud, but just a little prettier.
Oh, yes. They probably cleaned it up, and they said as exact as the first one was. It doesn't do the Lord justice. In this one, the particular coin here, gold survived because it wasn't circulated as much, but it's very soft, and unfortunately this coin, the nose has been flattened, pressed into something. That isn't the way it was originally. But the point you want to look at the two parallel lines.
Again, on the neck.
Under the neck, exactly as they appear on the shroud.
You know, and again, the point of significance here would be that the die cutter who was charged to make this image was looking at something, and we believe that something was the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, he had to be looking,
and that would be
either at that or an exact copy of it. Remember, not everybody was permitted to see it.
Right, and this coin was cast in 692.
2 to 695, again in the 7th century.
Again, this is just fascinating stuff, and we're going to come right back to this in just a minute, so stay tuned to the Shroud Report. Hi, I'm Russ Breault, and welcome back to the Shroud Report. And my guest today is Father Kim Dreisbach from Atlanta, Georgia. And Kim, this is just amazingly mysterious things that we're talking about here: spy clues and historical references, art references, but you know, part of this whole exercise is trying to piece together the historical trail, because it's not continuous, and there are gaps, and it's what happened in 944 and what happened in 1204. These seems to be significant dates for this thing.
Well, in 944, the shroud was transferred from Edessa to Constantinople. By that time, the Muslims had taken over Edessa. There was fear for the safety of the shroud. It was ransomed for the release of Muslim prisoners and 300 pieces of silver, and it's brought to Constantinople in August of 944. And there it remains until 1204, when the Fourth Crusade, sailing out of Venice under the Doge, goes to Constantinople, and probably the greatest tragedy in Christianity. Western Christendom invades Eastern Christendom and destroys the city, captures it, and the shroud disappears. We know not where, according to the chronicler Robert de Clary. Neither Frenchman nor Greek knew what happened to it. And it goes underground until about 1357 or so, when it shows up in Lyria in France. So the question has been, we have a shroud that showed up in France. Is it the same shroud that left Constantinople? And I think we have some spy clues that will show us that is the case. We're looking here at the dorsal or back view of the shroud. Now you see the patches, they look like two U's on either side coming underneath the shoulders with white bottoms. Go beneath that, and you will see, if you look carefully, they're dark in color, but there is a right angle pattern, and what it really is 4 burn holes in a right angle pattern. One on the right and one on the left. We have the same thing on the ventral or the front. So what had happened is this cloth was folded in such a way that probably hot coals from a censer, that which makes smoke, a liturgical practice, burned its way through 4 layers of the cloth. In fact, one of them only has 3 holes as opposed to 4, so it didn't quite burn through to the last layer. The bottom layer only has 3 holes. If you were to go to Turin today, you would see those 4 burn holes, the L-shaped pattern, still on the shroud. Now there are some clues as to when they came. Was it from the fire in 1532, the one we know that's responsible for the patches underneath and above them? Or were they on there at another time, possibly even earlier? And I think we have some spy clues that show us they were there before the shroud ever got to Europe.
So we're going to go to our next slide then.
Yes. What you're looking at here is a 1/3 size copy of the shroud in the Cathedral of Saint-Gomer in Lier in Belgium. It's falsely attributed to Albrecht Dürer, probably done by a royal court painter. But notice, one, there are no patches on here. This was painted in 1516, 16 years before the fire of 1532 at Chambéry.
So all those big burns and patches and
they're
lines and
not
scorch
there.
marks,
The
they're not there.
marks, watermarks, none of them are there. But guess what is? Come in closely, and looking under the arms on the ventral of the front part, and again down around the hips on the dorsal or back part, you'll see that same configuration of 4 burn holes in an L-shaped pattern. This probably happened from something that is called a thurible. It is something that holds incense and hot coals. And even to this day in the Orthodox churches, when they smoke the epitaphioi, the cloths that have the image of the shroud on them, sometimes either coal or hot incense will fall out and make these burn holes even today. Could it be, we know it's before the big fire, we trace it back even further? And I think we can.
Okay, so we're going to go to our next slide.
This is from something called the Hungarian Prey manuscript, Prey being the town in Hungary from whence it comes. It is accurately dated at least from 1192 to 1195, but it may be based on something that is even 100 years earlier. In the top register, you see the naked body laid out with the hands crossed over the pubis, and if you count the fingers, there are only 4 on each hand, exactly like the shroud, where the thumbs are folded underneath. But the big significance of this illumination is down in the lower register. Underneath the body in the cloth, twice, both on the upper cloth and on the lower one where you see the red crosses, so to speak, an attempt to replicate the 3-to-1 herringbone twill weave pattern, you will find that same pattern of 4 burn holes in an L-shaped pattern.
I think we have a slide here.
We have a close-up?
That's a close-up of that.
All right, there's at least one of them. And what this is showing us is These holes were on the shroud. Remember, it didn't leave Constantinople until 1204. This illumination, the illustration was done 1192 to 1195 or earlier. So these were on the shroud before it ever left Constantinople. What it shows us is that the cloth which left Constantinople is the same one which arrived in Europe and showed up in Lire in France somewhere around 1357.
So when you put it all together, you have historical descriptions of this Mendelian cloth, of this, as you said, that shroud that left Constantinople is described as an image not made with hands, without the use of painter's art. It was a faint image, and it had a side wound, and then there's the pollen trail, which kind of also corroborates the whole historical trail. And
the pollen trail corroborates the historical trail of where it's been. You have written documents, you have numismatics, you have art and iconography.
And then you have this, which is just this seems to be a capstone piece of evidence here.
Oh, yes. It's overwhelming. The preponderance of evidence definitely shows that the shroud, in all probability, is authentic. Though the most that science can ever say is that this shroud probably wrapped the historical body of Jesus of Nazareth. It cannot say it wrapped the Christ, because there is no test for Christness, and it can't make theological statements. At that point, it is up to the individual to decide for him or herself. The question that the shroud asks, who do you say that I am?
Yeah.
Just a first century victim of crucifixion or something more?
Yeah. Well, I tell you, that's a wonderful note for us to just say. We'll be right back in just a minute with more of the Shroud Report. Hi, I'm Russ Breault, and we're back to the Shroud Report. Our guest today has been Father Kim Dreisbach from Atlanta, Georgia. This has been a fascinating journey through history, through art, and through 20 centuries, it seems. And I just can't imagine a subject that's more fascinating. And what if you had a final thought to share on this subject? What would it be?
Well, through the years, I've heard many definitions of the shroud. Obviously, wearing this costume, you can tell that I have a bias, though I began convinced that it was an absolute fake, and now I'm convinced it's absolutely authentic. Of all the definitions I've ever heard, one from a professor at Barnard College, the women's part of Columbia, sticks in my mind. Her name is Iwa Kurlak. She says, the shroud is a linen archiriopoetas, an image not made by human hands, having been made by first having touched Christ with the purpose of touching others. That's the definition I think I'll carry to my own grave.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to close. And thank you very much for joining us here on the Shroud Report, Kim.
More than welcome, and thank you for asking me, Russ.
Thank you very much. And stay tuned for the next Shroud Report.